Laughter echoed through the hallway of the Mercer mansion. Celeste fell hard onto the marble floor, her knees slamming against the cold stone, her palms scraping across the surface. The woman who had shoved her looked down with a thin smile. "Oh, I didn't see you there. You should be more careful in this house." Margaret Mercer, her mother-in-law, stood at the end of the hallway. She watched everything from beginning to end. She said nothing. She simply turned around and walked away, as if there was nothing in front of her worth stopping for. Celeste pulled herself up. Blood seeped through the fabric of her dress at the knee. No one offered a hand. No one asked if she was okay. She straightened her back and kept walking slower, but her spine never bent. Just 6 months ago, Celeste Dawson was selling pastries in a small bakery on the outskirts of Detroit. Half of her face carried burn scars from a gas explosion that nearly took her life. On the street, people glanced at her and looked away. No one wanted to stand close. No one looked for more than 2 seconds. Until one day, a man walked into her bakery, a man that no one in Chicago dared to look in the eye. But standing in front of Celeste, he was the first person who did not look away. Knox Mercer, the boss of the Mercer Empire. And everything began with that $4 pastry. But loving Knox Mercer was not just loving a man, it was stepping into a world where the most dangerous enemy was not standing outside the gate, but sitting right at the family dinner table. If this story touched your heart, hit like and share it so more people can hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story. 6 months before Celeste collapsed onto the marble floor inside the Mercer mansion, Knox Mercer sat at the head of the conference table on the 32nd floor of the Mercer Holdings building in the heart of Chicago. The conference room was spacious, with a high ceiling, but the air inside felt thick and heavy. Across the table, a middle-aged man named Raymond Holt sat with both hands clasped together, his fingers laced so tightly they had gone pale. Raymond owed Mercer Holdings a large sum of money, had asked for an extension twice, and today was the 3rd time he had sat in that same chair with the same plea. Knox didn't say a word during the first 5 minutes. He only sat there and listened, both hands resting on the tabletop, his eyes fixed straight on Raymond without blinking. When Raymond finished speaking, Knox opened a drawer, took out a folder that had already been prepared, and slid it lightly across the oak table. "This is the contract to acquire your entire company. The price is exactly equal to the amount you owe. You sign today, or tomorrow I buy it for nothing." Raymond looked down at the folder, then up at Knox, then down again. His hand trembled when he picked up the pen. He signed. Knox stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out of the conference room without looking back. That afternoon, Margaret Mercer called Knox. She said there was a real estate project in the suburbs of Detroit that Knox needed to inspect personally. An old neighborhood, full of run-down houses, with cheap land. Margaret wanted to buy the entire area and build a shopping center. "You have to go. This is a major deal for the family," Margaret said over the phone. Knox didn't want to go. He didn't like trips Margaret arranged, because whenever she arranged something, there was always a purpose she hadn't revealed yet. But Knox went anyway, because it was work. Knox arrived in Detroit on a late autumn afternoon. He stepped out of the car with 2 bodyguards, dressed in a dark suit and polished leather shoes, in the middle of a street where everything looked worn down and broken. Brick walls were peeling, windows were boarded up, and the sidewalk was cracked. Most of the stores had closed, their signs hanging crooked, their paint faded. Only one shop was still open. A small bakery sat on the corner, its glass door slightly fogged, warm yellow light glowing inside. Knox pushed the door open and stepped in. The doorbell gave a bright little jingle. Celeste Dawson stood behind the counter. She was wiping her hands on a cloth apron, her hair tied neatly at the back of her neck. When she looked up at the customer, the left side of her face showed under the light. A burn scar ran from her temple down her cheek, spread across her neck, and disappeared beneath her collar. The skin was wrinkled, discolored, like a map of something that had burned to the ground long ago. Knox's 2 bodyguards looked at Celeste, and then both of them looked away almost at the same time. It was a reflex Celeste knew well. She knew that look. She had seen it hundreds of times, on hundreds of different faces. Look, then turn away, quickly, as if the scar on her face were something that could spread. But the man standing in the middle of the bakery didn't turn away. Knox looked at Celeste. He didn't look at the scar. He didn't look somewhere else. He looked at her whole face, at the eyes that stared back at him, without the slightest hesitation. "Give me 1 pastry," Knox said. Celeste took a waffle pastry from the glass tray, placed it in a paper bag, and handed it across the counter. When her hand brushed Knox's in the brief moment of passing him the bag, she didn't pull back. She looked straight into his eyes and said, $4. Knox didn't pay $4. He placed a $100 bill on the counter, then turned and walked toward the door. Celeste called after him, her voice calm. "You're missing $96 in change." Knox stopped. He turned back and looked at her. In that tiny bakery in the suburbs of Detroit, on a street that was slowly dying, a girl whose face was covered in burn scars had just called the most powerful Mafia boss in Chicago back to take his change. She didn't know who he was, and perhaps, even if she had known, she would have said the exact same thing. The corner of Knox's mouth lifted, just a little, so quickly that anyone who wasn't looking closely would have missed it. It was the closest thing to a smile that anyone around Knox had witnessed in many years. Knox stepped out to the car, sat in the back seat, and closed the door. The 2 bodyguards waited for his order. Knox sat still for a long while, his eyes looking through the window toward the little bakery. Then he said, in a voice as ordinary as if he were talking about the weather, "This neighborhood stays as it is. Don't buy it." The bodyguard in the front seat turned back to look at Knox, not understanding. This project was Margaret's order, the deal she had spent 3 months preparing the paperwork for. Knox didn't explain. He had never needed to explain. The car rolled away from the rundown old street in Detroit, but Knox knew he would come back. Not because of this neighborhood, not because of the project, but because, for the first time in a very long time, someone had looked at him without fear, without lowering her head, without flattery, without needing anything from him. Just $4 for a pastry, and $96 in change. Knox Mercer, the man all of Chicago bowed before, had just been asked for his change by a girl selling pastries, her face covered in burn scars, and he couldn't stop thinking about it. Knox returned to Chicago the very next day. He didn't tell anyone about the bakery, about the girl, or about the $96 in change. But 3 days later, Knox made one single phone call. 1 week after that, Celeste Dawson received an offer. A small apartment on the west side of Chicago, clean, fully furnished, with 6 months of rent already paid in advance, along with a baker position at a restaurant under the Mercer Holdings system. The person who called Celeste didn't say who was behind the offer. They only said it was a job opportunity. Celeste wasn't stupid. She knew that $4 pastry that day hadn't been a coincidence, but she also knew there was nothing left in Detroit to keep her there. The bakery's lease had run out. The neighborhood was dying. She accepted, not because of Knox Mercer, but because she needed to live. Celeste arrived in Chicago at the beginning of winter. She started working in the restaurant kitchen, and no one knew who she was. No one asked. She baked, she stayed quiet, and she lived. Knox stopped by the restaurant once a week, then twice, then 3 times. He never went into the kitchen. He sat at a table outside, ordered coffee, and waited. He waited until Celeste finished her shift, stepped out through the back door, and then he would stand leaning against his car and say exactly one sentence to her. "I'll drive you home." The first time, Celeste refused. The second time, she refused. The third time, she still refused, but that time, she stood there for 10 more seconds before turning away. The fourth time, she got into the car. They didn't say anything the whole way back. Knox drove. Celeste looked out the window. When the car stopped in front of her apartment, Celeste opened the door and stepped out, then turned back and said, "The coffee at your restaurant isn't good. Next time, I'll make you a cup the right way." That was the first time Knox Mercer had truly smiled in front of another person in many years. Not a slight lift of the mouth, not a half smile, a real smile. It didn't take Margaret Mercer long to find out. She had people watching Knox's every schedule, not because she didn't trust her son, but because she believed control was protection. When her people reported that Knox was seeing a girl, Margaret didn't get angry. She ordered an investigation. 2 days later, a thick file lay on her desk. Celeste Dawson, 27 years old, orphaned, raised in the shelter system in Detroit from the age of 6. No father, no mother, no relatives. Had worked at 4 different bakeries before opening her own. Her bakery had burned down in a gas tank explosion 3 years earlier. Celeste survived, but she carried severe burn scars across the left half of her face, her neck, and her arm. No assets, No advanced degree, no lineage. Margaret finished reading, closed the file, and called Knox to her private room in the mansion. Knox walked into the room. Margaret sat behind the desk, the file placed in front of her. She didn't circle around the matter. "Sit down," Margaret said. Knox didn't sit. He stood with both hands in his pants pockets, looking at his mother. Margaret opened the file and pushed it across the desk. "I know who you're seeing. Celeste Dawson. Orphaned. Shelter system. Half her face burned. Do you want all of Chicago to know that Knox Mercer's wife grew up with no father, no mother, in a government shelter?" Knox looked down at the file, then looked back at his mother. "You had someone investigate her?" Margaret didn't deny it. "I'm protecting this family. That's what I've always done." Knox nodded slowly, as if weighing every word before he spoke. "You grew up in silk and privilege, in mansions, with a father and a mother, with everything, and you still lacked the most important thing. Don't talk to me about deprivation." Margaret stood, both hands braced on the desktop. "You're not allowed to speak to me that way." Knox turned and walked toward the door. "I'm not asking for permission," he said without looking back. Margaret didn't stop there. She never stopped there. 3 days later, on an afternoon when Knox was at the office, Margaret drove herself to Celeste's apartment on the west side of the city. She knocked on the door. Celeste opened it, and standing in front of her was a woman Celeste had never met. But the moment she saw her eyes, Celeste knew exactly who she was. The same eyes, cold, sharp, and measuring everything in an instant. Margaret stepped inside without waiting to be invited. She looked around the apartment, at the blank walls, the small table, the old refrigerator, then looked at Celeste. She looked straight at the burned half of her face, without hiding it, without looking away. "I'm Margaret Mercer, Knox's mother, and I've come here to speak frankly with you." Celeste didn't step back. She stood still, both arms resting at her sides. Margaret placed the file on the table. "I know who you are. I know where you came from. And I know you don't belong in my son's world." Celeste looked at the file but didn't open it. Margaret continued, "Do you think my son will look at this face every morning when he wakes up and not regret it? Do you think he'll take you to parties, to meetings, stand in front of hundreds of people with you, and feel nothing? You're deluding yourself, Celeste." Celeste had been silent from the beginning until now. She looked at Margaret, not with anger and not with fear. She looked with the eyes of someone who was used to words like that, who had heard them hundreds of times from hundreds of different people, and had remained standing after every single time. "Knox looks at me every day," Celeste said, her voice calm. "He's never looked away." Margaret didn't answer. She stood still for a moment, then picked up the file, turned around, and walked out the door. She didn't look back, but Celeste noticed one thing. Margaret was gripping the file so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. She wasn't as calm as she wanted to appear, and that was the first time Celeste understood that this battle had only just begun. 2 weeks after the meeting between Margaret and Celeste, Knox did something no one in the Mercer family had expected. He sent invitations to 23 people, including his closest business partners, the family's longtime allies, and several important faces in Chicago's upper circle. The dinner was held at Mercer Holdings' private restaurant on the 20th floor, a place where, every time Knox opened that room, it meant something serious was happening. No one refused an invitation from Knox Mercer. Never. At 7 o'clock in the evening, the guests began to arrive. Men wore dark suits, women wore long gowns, and expensive perfume mingled with the scent of wine. Margaret arrived earliest, sitting in the middle of the long table, the seat she had always taken for the past 20 years since her husband passed away. She wore black, her hair pinned high, her face calm as though she already knew everything that would happen tonight. But she didn't know. No one knew. Paige Conroy sat 3 seats away from Margaret, beside her mother, Dorothy Conroy. Paige wore a white dress, her curls falling over her shoulders, a gold necklace around her neck that Knox had once given the Conroy family during a business partnership many years earlier. Paige was 26 years old, beautiful in the way Chicago's elite called perfect, and for the past 4 years, she had lived with the belief that she would become Knox Mercer's wife, because the two families had quietly arranged it, because Margaret had nodded her approval, because everything seemed to be in its proper place. Tonight, Paige sat with her back straight, smiling at each person who walked in, confident as if the future mistress of the Mercer Empire were already receiving guests. Then the door to the room opened. Knox walked in, and beside him, with his hand resting lightly against her back, was Celeste Dawson. The entire room went silent in an instant. Not because of Knox, because every room Knox entered always fell silent, but because of Celeste. She wore a simple black dress, no jewelry, her hair falling naturally, and the left side of her face, the burn scar stretching from her temple down to her neck, was turned outward, not covered, not hidden, not concealed under makeup. Knox led Celeste past 23 pairs of staring eyes. He didn't look at anyone. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the highest seat, the seat where only Knox or Margaret had ever sat before, and he let Celeste sit down. Then Knox sat beside her. Margaret didn't move, but her hands, resting in her lap beneath the table, tightened around each other. Paige looked at Celeste, then at Knox, then back at Celeste. The smile on her lips slowly faded, like a ritual in a draft. Dinner began in a heavy silence. The servers brought out the food. Wine was poured into glasses, but no one spoke naturally. Everyone ate, their eyes sliding toward Celeste, then toward Margaret, then toward one another. Knox ate as if nothing were unusual, occasionally leaning toward Celeste to say something softly, and Celeste would nod or smile. She didn't speak much. She didn't need to speak much. When the main course had been cleared and the second glass of wine had been poured, Knox stood. He didn't tap his glass. He didn't wait for anyone's attention. He simply stood up, and the whole room automatically went quiet. "I invited everyone here tonight for one reason," Knox said, his voice calm, as if he were reading a clause in a contract. "This is Celeste Dawson. She will be my wife. That isn't a question. It isn't a proposal, and it isn't a topic for discussion. I'm informing you, not asking for opinions." The room went deathly still. 23 people sat frozen in place. Margaret stared straight ahead, her face expressionless, but her jaw was clenched so tightly the tendons stood out. Paige looked down at her plate, both hands gripping the napkin in her lap, her fingers gone white. Then a man seated in the middle of the table stood, Warren Caldwell, 62 years old, a business partner of Mercer Holdings for the past 15 years, and the person closest to Margaret. He cleared his throat, looked around the room as if searching for agreement, then said, "Knox, I respect you, but as someone who has worked with this family since your father was alive, I think this decision needs to be considered more carefully. The Mercer family has standards. There is an image to protect. I don't think." Knox didn't let Warren finish. He didn't cut him off by speaking louder. He only looked at Warren, and Warren stopped on his own, as if Knox's eyes had blocked the sentence right in his throat. Knox spoke, his voice neither rising nor falling, flat and steady as still water. "Warren, you have 24 hours to leave every contract with Mercer Holdings. All of them. There's nothing more to say. This isn't an offer." Warren stood there, his mouth slightly open, not yet able to react. No one in the room moved. No one spoke up to defend Warren. No one dared. Knox sat down, picked up his wineglass, took a sip, then turned to Celeste and said something quietly. Celeste nodded. Dinner continued, but Warren Caldwell didn't sit back down. He stood there for 3 more seconds, then quietly walked out of the room. No one watched him leave. When the dinner ended, the guests departed one by one. No one came to greet Margaret. No one came to speak to Paige. Everyone left quickly, eyes lowered, as if they had just witnessed a sentence being handed down, and no one wanted to be touched by it. In the car on the way home, Paige sat beside Dorothy, silent for the first 10 minutes. Then she spoke, her voice trembling, not from sadness, but from something deeper than sadness. She carries a face like that, and still dares to stand beside Knox Mercer, in front of everyone, sitting in that seat. That seat was supposed to be mine. Dorothy placed her hand over her daughter's and squeezed gently. "Stay calm. Margaret won't let this rest. She isn't the kind of woman who accepts defeat." Paige turned her face toward the car window, the streetlights running across her features in passing streaks. She didn't cry, but in the darkness of the back seat, her hands clenched so tightly that her nails dug into her palms, and she didn't feel the pain, because the pain inside was so much greater. After that dinner, the news spread through Chicago's upper class like fire meeting wind. Knox Mercer had publicly introduced a girl no one knew, a girl with burn scars on her face, a girl who had come from the shelter system and declared that she would be his wife. Warren Caldwell had been expelled from every contract with Mercer Holdings simply because he had dared to open his mouth and object. People told and retold that story at afternoon teas, in cigar rooms, and in cars on the way home. And every time the story was told again, it ended with the same sentence: never challenge Knox Mercer. But Paige Conroy didn't listen to that warning. She couldn't listen. In her mind, there was only one image repeating again and again: Celeste, sitting at the head of the table, in the seat Paige had imagined herself sitting in for the past 4 years. She had chosen a dress for that day, had thought about the hairstyle she would wear for that day, had practiced smiling in front of the mirror for that day, and that day had come, but the person sitting in that chair wasn't her. That pain didn't grow smaller with time. It grew. It turned into something else. 3 weeks after the dinner, Chicago's upper class held a gathering at the private Lakeshore Club. Paige arrived early, wearing a red dress, her makeup carefully done, smiling and talking to everyone as if nothing had happened. But when someone mentioned Knox, mentioned the wedding that was coming, Paige stopped her wine glass in front of her mouth for 1 second, then drank it down. She set the glass down, turned toward the group of women standing around her, and said in a voice loud enough for the whole corner of the room to hear, "Someone should tell Knox that pity isn't love. He's marrying her because he feels sorry for her, not because he wants to look at that face every morning when he wakes up." The group of women fell silent. A few looked down into their wine glasses. A few exchanged glances. Paige still didn't stop. She tilted her head, took another sip from a fresh glass of wine, then added, "A face like that should stay that way forever. It deserves to." No one answered. But no one objected either. That silence, to Paige, felt like agreement. She smiled, but her eyes didn't smile. Those eyes were burning. Celeste wasn't at that gathering. She heard Paige's words from a familiar server at the Mercer restaurant, someone who had been at Lakeshore and had heard everything. After Celeste finished listening, she fell silent. She didn't get angry, didn't cry, didn't tell Knox. That night, she sat in front of the mirror in her apartment and looked at the left side of her face for a very long time. She had looked at this face thousands of times. She knew every fold of the scar, every patch of discolored skin, every angle where the light would make it look worse or a little softer. She didn't hate her face. It had taken her 3 years to move from hatred to acceptance, and another year to move from acceptance to no longer caring. But Paige's words didn't strike her face. They struck somewhere deeper. They reminded her that even though she had stopped caring, the world outside had never stopped. 1 month later, Knox took Celeste to a charity fundraiser for a children's hospital at the Peninsula Hotel. This was the first time Celeste had appeared at a public event since the dinner at the Mercer restaurant. She wore a dark dress, her hair loose, no jewelry. Knox walked beside her, his hand resting lightly on her back. When they entered, the ballroom was wide and filled with hundreds of people, and once again, all those eyes fell on Celeste. She was used to it. She kept walking. In the middle of the evening, Knox crossed to another table to speak with a group of partners. Celeste stood alone beside the drink table, holding a glass of water. That was when Paige appeared. She walked straight toward Celeste, stopped 1 step away, and looked her up and down. "Celeste," Paige said, her voice sweet as sugar but cold as ice. "Standing here among all these people, don't you feel out of place? Everyone is looking at you, but I'm afraid it isn't because they admire you." Celeste placed her glass of water on the table. She didn't leave. She didn't look around for Knox. She turned toward Paige, looked straight into her eyes, and for the first time, Paige saw that there was no fear in those eyes, no shame, no pleading. "I know they're looking," Celeste said, her voice calm, every word clear. "I've known that since the first day I walked out onto the street with this face. I know what they think. I know what they say behind my back. I know all of it, but I'm still standing here." Celeste paused for a beat, then continued. "And you, Paige, you have everything I don't have. A beautiful face, a wealthy family, every door already opened for you. So why are you the one standing here trembling?" Paige didn't answer. Her mouth parted, but no words came out. Her hand tightened around her wineglass, and she realized Celeste was right. She was trembling. Not because of the cold, not because of the wine, but because standing in front of Celeste, she saw something she didn't have and could never buy with money or beauty. The calmness of someone who had lost everything and still remained standing. Paige turned away, walking quickly toward the door. the wineglass still in her hand, her face lowered. From the other side of the room, Knox saw the entire exchange. He began walking toward Celeste, but stopped halfway. He saw Celeste standing straight, her eyes calm, not shaken in the slightest. And he understood that she didn't need him in that moment. She had never needed anyone to save her. She only needed someone who wouldn't look away, and he was that person. That night, Paige sat in the car while Dorothy drove home. She didn't say anything for the entire ride. Dorothy glanced at her daughter, wanting to ask, but not daring to. When the car stopped in front of the house, Paige still sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the window. She thought about what she had said at the Lakeshore Club, about the curse she had thrown toward Celeste, about the burned, scarred face she had mocked. She didn't know that sometimes a curse doesn't fly away. It comes back. While Paige was still swallowing the bleeding humiliation from the charity event at the peninsula, another danger was moving toward Knox Mercer from a direction he had never expected. Twice a year, the families that controlled different territories in Chicago held a closed meeting at an old restaurant in Bridgeport, a place with no cameras, no outsiders, only bosses sitting around a round table and speaking in a language ordinary people wouldn't understand. This meeting had 7 men. Knox sat in his familiar position, his back against the wall, his eyes watching each person as they entered. He knew every face. He knew who could be trusted, who couldn't, who owed whom, and who wanted what. But when the last man walked in, Knox frowned, not because he didn't know him, but because he knew him very well. Garrett Shaw, 40 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, with a square face and a small scar across the bridge of his nose from an incident 10 years earlier that no one ever mentioned again. Garrett controlled the entire south side of Chicago, from back of the yards to Englewood. He did business in underground casinos, loan sharking, and the transport of goods that no one asked questions about. Garrett and Knox had once been allies when Knox's father was still alive, but ever since Knox took power, Garrett had begun to push in, little by little. One neighborhood here, one contract there. Slowly, patiently, like water wearing down stone. Knox knew it, but he hadn't moved against him, because Garrett hadn't crossed the line yet. Today, Garrett walked into the room with a wide smile, shook hands with each man, and sat down across from Knox. The meeting went normally for the first half hour, dividing territory, settling small disputes, reaching agreements on transportation routes. Knox spoke little, listened much, nodded when necessary, and everything moved in its proper order. Until Garrett spoke, his voice slow, his hand turning the glass of wine on the table. "By the way, Knox, I heard you recently hosted a very interesting dinner. All of Chicago is talking. I hear you're marrying a girl from the suburbs of Detroit. Her face is, how should I put it? A little special, isn't it?" Garrett laughed, his eyes moving around the table in search of support. A few men lowered their faces. No one laughed with him, because everyone was looking at Knox. Knox didn't react right away. He set his wineglass down on the table, slowly, gently, without a sound. Then he stood. The whole room went silent. Knox walked around the table, each step even, neither fast nor slow, until he stood directly behind Garrett. Garrett remained seated, but the smile on his face began to stiffen. Knox bent down, placed one hand on the back of Garrett's chair, and whispered into his ear. No one in the room heard what Knox said. They only saw Garrett sit motionless for 10 seconds, then saw the color drain from his face. Not red, white, deathly white. Knox straightened, patted Garrett lightly on the shoulder as if patting an old friend, then returned to his seat. He picked up his wineglass, took a sip, and said to the entire table, "Does anyone need to discuss anything else?" No one said a word. Garrett sat still for the rest of the meeting, without opening his mouth even once more. When the meeting ended, he stood, walked out the door without saying goodbye to anyone. His hand, tucked into his pants pocket, was still trembling. No one knew what Knox had whispered into Garrett Shaw's ear that night, but everyone understood that whatever Knox had said, it had been enough. However, Garrett Shaw wasn't the kind of man who got threatened and then backed away. He was the kind of man who got threatened and then found another way. And that other way came from a source no one expected. 3 days after the meeting, Margaret Mercer picked up the phone and called a number she had never called before. On the other end of the line, Garrett Shaw answered. The call lasted 14 minutes. No one recorded it, and no one witnessed it. But from that night on, Margaret began sending Garrett information only someone inside the Mercer family would know: Knox's travel schedule, the list of partners currently in negotiation, internal financial figures. Margaret didn't call it betrayal. In her mind, this was protection. She was protecting the family from a burned, scarred girl selling pastries in Detroit by handing the keys to her own house to the enemy standing outside the gate. She didn't realize that once that door opened, it wouldn't be able to close again. The wedding took place on a late winter day, simpler than anyone in Chicago's upper class had imagined. There were no hundreds of guests, no reporters, no party stretching until midnight. Knox didn't want to turn the wedding into a performance. There was only Jonah Pike, who flew in from Detroit to be the sole best man, a few of Knox's trusted people, and an old pastor. Margaret was there, sitting in the front row, her face calm, her eyes cold. She didn't cry, didn't smile, didn't offer a single word of blessing. When the ceremony ended, she stood, walked out to her car, and drove back to the mansion before everyone else. On the first day Celeste stepped into the Mercer mansion, as Knox's wife, he led her through each room. He held her hand, walked slowly, and explained every detail in a voice Celeste had never heard him use before. Soft, patient, almost gentle. "This room is the library. No one comes in here except me, and now, you. This room is the main dining room. The chair at the head of the table on the right is yours. This room is the kitchen. Whenever you want to bake, the kitchen is yours." Celeste walked beside Knox, listening to him speak, and for the first time since coming to Chicago, she felt she had a place where she belonged. But that feeling lasted exactly 3 days, because on the 4th day, Knox began going back to work, and every morning, when Knox left the mansion, the house changed. Margaret didn't scream. She didn't smash things, didn't curse, didn't do anything Celeste could point to and say, "She's hurting me." Margaret tormented Celeste with a more delicate weapon. Whenever guests came to the mansion, Margaret called Celeste down to the sitting room, not to introduce her, but to have her pour tea. "Celeste, would you mind pouring tea for my guests? The servants are busy." Celeste poured the tea. The first time, she thought perhaps Margaret truly needed help. The second time, she began to suspect. The third time, when Margaret told the guests, "She pours tea very gracefully. I have to admit, she's very good at serving." And the whole sitting room gave a soft little laugh. Celeste understood. She wasn't a daughter-in-law in Margaret's eyes. She was a servant Margaret wanted everyone else to see. Every day, Margaret found one new way. A gentle sentence in front of guests. "Celeste isn't used to how this house operates yet. Please forgive her." A reminder in front of the servants. "Remember to guide Celeste. She doesn't know which silverware goes with which course." Every sentence was light. Every sentence could be explained as kindness. Every sentence could be defended as concern. But Celeste knew. She knew because she had heard enough soft words in her life, from shelter workers saying, "We only want what's best for you," while moving her from one house to another, from strangers on the street saying, "Poor thing," before walking away. She knew how to tell the difference between care and humiliation, wrapped in beautiful paper. But she didn't tell Knox, because if she did, Knox would confront Margaret, and Celeste didn't want to be the reason a man lost his mother. That wasn't the only time Celeste was hurt in this mansion, but there was one time when the wound wasn't only made of words. That night, Celeste sat alone on the bed in the bedroom. She rolled up her pant leg and looked at the purple bruise spreading across her knee. The skin around the bruise was slightly swollen, and it stung when touched. She took a wet towel from the bathroom, folded it neatly, placed it over the injury, and sat still. No one knew she was sitting there. No one heard her slowing her breath to hold back the pain. No one saw the tear running down the unscarred half of her face, then falling onto her hand, falling onto the wet towel, falling into silence. Celeste didn't cry because of the pain in her knee. She cried because this was the first time since the gas explosion that she felt completely alone again. In Detroit, she was alone, but she was free. Here, she was alone in a house full of people, and no one was on her side. Knox returned to the mansion at nearly 11 o'clock at night. He walked up to the bedroom and saw Celeste lying in bed, the lights already off. He didn't wake her, but the next morning, when Celeste came down to the kitchen, Knox noticed she was limping, only slightly, almost impossible to see. But Knox was a man who noticed the smallest details. He asked, "What happened to you?" Celeste shook her head. Nothing. I slipped, that's all. Knox looked at her and said nothing more, but he didn't believe her. He had never believed anyone who said nothing. That afternoon, Knox called the head of security into his private room. Show me all the second-floor hallway camera footage, from 6 o'clock in the morning to 4 o'clock in the afternoon yesterday. He sat and watched every segment, his eyes never leaving the screen, and he saw it. He saw everything. He said nothing. He turned off the screen, sat still for 1 minute, then picked up the phone. He made only one call. On the other end was the husband of the woman who had shoved Celeste, a minor partner with 3 material supply contracts with Mercer Holdings. Knox said exactly 2 sentences, his voice normal, neither rising nor falling, as if he were reading the weather forecast. The call lasted less than 1 minute. The next morning, the legal department at Mercer Holdings sent notice terminating all 3 contracts. No reason, no negotiation, no chance to appeal. The husband's company lost its largest source of revenue in one night. The news spread quickly. No one knew exactly what had happened, but Chicago's upper class put the pieces together on their own. That woman had once been a guest inside the Mercer mansion. She had done something to Celeste, and her husband lost everything. No one confirmed it, and no one denied it. Knox didn't say a single word about it. He didn't need to. His silence was already the answer. And from that day on, inside the Mercer mansion, whenever guests came, no one stood too close to Celeste, but no one dared treat her as less than anyone else in that house anymore. After the contract termination, the Mercer mansion stayed quiet for 2 weeks. Margaret didn't mock Celeste, didn't order her to serve tea, didn't invite guests over. She stepped back, as if she were waiting for something. Celeste recognized that silence wasn't peace. She had lived long enough to know that when someone like Margaret stopped attacking, it meant she was preparing something larger. Then Knox received a phone call. The deal in Las Vegas had run into trouble. An important partner was threatening to pull out, and unless Knox handled it personally, Mercer Holdings would lose a contract worth millions of dollars. Knox had to go. He knew that, but he didn't want to leave Celeste. The night before he left, Knox sat on the edge of the bed, and Celeste sat beside him. He held her hand, his fingers slipping between hers, tightening gently. "I'll be gone 3 days, as quickly as I can." Celeste nodded. "I know." Knox looked at her, his eyes resting on her face longer than usual, as if he were trying to memorize every line before leaving. "If anything happens, call me. Anytime." Celeste smiled, the smile she used whenever she wanted to reassure Knox that she was all right, even when she wasn't sure she was. "I'll be fine." Knox didn't fully believe her, but he kissed her forehead, stood up, and the next morning, he got into the car for the airport. Celeste stood at the second-floor window, watching the black car roll out through the mansion gates, and she knew that from this second on, she was alone. Margaret acted that very afternoon, while Celeste was in the kitchen preparing dinner for herself. An unfamiliar car stopped in front of the mansion gates. A servant opened the door, and a girl stepped inside. Tina Wells, 28 years old, tall, slender, with light brown hair falling to her shoulders, skin smooth as porcelain, wearing a fitted cream dress, walking in high heels that didn't make a sound. Tina smiled brightly when Margaret came to greet her at the door. The two of them embraced, and Margaret took Tina's hand and led her into the dining room, as if she were welcoming a daughter home. Celeste didn't know who Tina was. She heard laughter from the dining room, Margaret's lively conversation, the sound of unfamiliar footsteps across the wooden floor. She wiped her hands, stepped out of the kitchen, and walked toward the dining room. When she reached the doorway, a servant stopped her. Not with a hand, and not with his body, only with one sentence, spoken in a low voice, eyes lowered, clearly instructed beforehand. "Ma'am, your seat has already been taken." Celeste stopped. She looked over the servant's shoulder into the dining room. The long dining table was set. The candles were lit, the silver plates arranged. Margaret sat in the middle seat, holding a glass of wine, and in the seat at the head of the table on the right, the seat Knox had shown Celeste on the first day she walked into this house. Her seat, Tina Wells was sitting. Tina looked up, saw Celeste standing in the doorway, and smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile. It was worse. It was the smile of someone who didn't see Celeste as a threat, didn't see her as worth concern, the smile of someone sitting in the right place and knowing she belonged there. Margaret lifted her eyes to Celeste, then turned to Tina, her voice warm. "Tina, you look absolutely beautiful tonight." Beautiful women light up an entire room. Margaret didn't look back at Celeste when she said that. She didn't need to. That sentence wasn't meant for Tina. It was meant for Celeste. And all three women in the room knew it. Celeste stood at the dining room doorway for 3 more seconds. She didn't say a word. She didn't argue, didn't ask, didn't explain. She turned around, walked up the stairs, and returned to the bedroom. She closed the door, sat down on the edge of the bed, and looked at her hands. The same hands that had kneaded dough, shaped pastries, built a small bakery from nothing. The same hands marked by burn scars along her left arm, the skin wrinkled and discolored. She clenched her hands, then opened them, then clenched them again. She didn't cry. She had cried enough. Near midnight, Celeste couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The mansion was quiet, but Celeste heard voices drifting up from downstairs. Small, distant, but in the late night, everything was clearer than it was by day. She recognized Margaret's voice. She was talking on the phone. Celeste hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but when she stepped into the hallway to get water, Margaret's voice floated up from the first-floor study through the staircase, and Celeste heard a name she recognized immediately. Garrett Shaw. Celeste froze at the top of the stairs. She knew that name. Knox had mentioned Garrett exactly once, not through a story, but through his tone. Knox's voice when he mentioned Garrett had been different from every other time. Colder. Harder. And Celeste knew that when Knox spoke about someone in that voice, that person was dangerous. Celeste sat down on the top stair, her back against the wall, and listened. Margaret was speaking to Garrett about Knox's schedule in Las Vegas, about the time Knox would return, about an internal meeting next week that only someone inside the family would know. Celeste heard every word, memorized every detail, her heart beating fast but her mind cold. She didn't run downstairs to confront Margaret. She didn't scream. She sat still, listened until Margaret hung up, then quietly returned to the bedroom, closed the door, picked up her phone, and called Knox. Knox answered after the second ring. His voice was low, slightly tired. "Celeste? What happened?" Celeste spoke, her voice calm, every word clear, not shaking, not rushed. "Knox, I just heard your mother talking on the phone with Garrett Shaw. She told him your schedule in Las Vegas, and about next week's internal meeting." The other end of the line went silent for 4 seconds. The longest 4 seconds Celeste had ever counted. Then Knox spoke, his voice unchanged, still calm, still even. But Celeste heard something beneath that calm, something burning. "Did you hear clearly? Tell me again. Every detail." And Celeste told him. Every detail, exactly as she had memorized it. Knox didn't sleep that night. After the call with Celeste, he sat in his hotel room in Las Vegas, the lights off, with only the city glow pouring through the glass from the 30th floor. He wasn't angry. Men like Knox didn't get angry the way ordinary people got angry. He didn't slam the table, didn't throw anything, didn't curse. He sat still, and he thought. Garrett Shaw was receiving internal information from Mercer Holdings. Someone inside the organization was selling information to the outside. Celeste said she had heard Margaret talking to Garrett, but Knox didn't rush to a conclusion. He knew his mother hated Celeste, but betraying the family to an enemy was something else. He needed proof. Not because he didn't believe Celeste, but because if it truly was his mother, he needed to know for certain before he acted, because once he acted, there would be no going back. The next morning, Knox canceled every meeting in Las Vegas. He called the internal security team and ordered them to examine the entire flow of information inside the organization over the past 3 months. Who had accessed which files? Who had sent emails to whom? Who had called which numbers? The results came back within 24 hours, and when Knox read the report, he closed the laptop screen and sat motionless for 3 minutes. Everything pointed to one person, Neil Braddock, 45 years old, employed by the Mercer family for 12 years. Knox's right hand in every major deal. The only person besides Knox who had access to the highest-level financial files. Neil knew Knox's schedule, knew who Knox was meeting, knew which contracts were being negotiated, knew everything. And over the past 6 weeks, Neil had called a disposable phone number a total of 17 times. The security team traced that number back, and it led to one of Garrett Shaw's men. Knox didn't have Neil taken immediately. He didn't call the bodyguards, didn't summon a meeting, didn't inform anyone. Instead, he picked up the phone and called Neil. His voice was normal, even friendly. "Neil, I'd like to invite you to dinner tonight. Just the two of us, no one else. It's been a long time since we sat down and talked." Neil was silent for 1 second on the other end of the line, then answered, "Of course, Knox. I'd be glad to." Knox put the phone down. He knew Neil would come. Because Neil didn't know that Knox knew, and that was the greatest advantage of all. Dinner took place at a small restaurant in Lincoln Park, a place Knox often went when he wanted to talk privately. A small table, a hidden corner, no cameras, no server standing too close. Knox arrived first and waited, his hand slowly turning a glass of water on the table. Neil arrived on time, wearing a gray suit. He shook Knox's hand and sat down. The two men ordered food. Knox asked about Neil's wife, asked what grade Neil's daughter was in, asked about the new house Neil had just bought in the suburbs. Neil answered each question, smiling, telling the story of how his daughter had just joined the school basketball team. Knox listened, nodded, smiled at the right moments. Dinner passed normally, comfortably, like two old colleagues sitting together and remembering the past. Until the plates were cleared, the final glasses of wine were poured, and Knox placed a small black USB drive on the table. Neil looked at the USB drive. He didn't touch it, but his face changed. Not much, just the tightening of his jaw, his eyes stopping for one blink too long, and his right hand, still holding the wine glass, lowering to the table more slowly than usual. Knox looked at Neil, his voice still calm, still even, as if he were reading the terms of an ordinary contract. "Inside this are 17 calls, 6 weeks, 3 IP addresses, and 2 accesses to level 1 financial files that you opened at midnight. They all lead to one place. And you know where that place is." Neil said nothing. He looked at Knox, and in his eyes, Knox saw what he had seen in so many people before. Fear. Not fear of being beaten, not fear of being punished. Fear because he understood that everything was over, and nothing could change it. "Knox, Neil began, but Knox raised one hand, gently, and Neil stopped halfway through. "I don't want to hear explanations," Knox said. "I don't need reasons. I'm giving you one night. Tonight. Take your wife and your child out of Chicago. Go wherever you want, I don't care. But leave before tomorrow morning. When the sun rises, you no longer exist in the Mercer system. Your name will be erased from every file, every contract, every account, as if you were never here." Knox stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and looked at Neil one last time. "Don't make me find you." He walked out of the restaurant without looking back. Neil Braddock left Chicago that night. He woke his wife and child at 2 o'clock in the morning, packed their things into 2 suitcases, and drove out of the city before dawn. No one knew where he went. No one asked. In the car on the way back to the hotel, Knox sat silent for a long while. Then he took out his phone and called Celeste. The phone rang twice. Celeste answered, her voice awake. She hadn't slept. Knox said, "You just saved everything I built. If you hadn't heard that phone call that night, I wouldn't have known there was a traitor until it was too late." Silence. Celeste didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then she spoke, her voice soft. "Come home." Knox wanted to ask more. He wanted to ask Celeste about the phone call between Margaret and Garrett that she had told him about. But Celeste had only said she heard Margaret mention Garrett, and Knox had found the traitor, Neil. In Knox's mind, everything fit together. Neil had sold information to Garrett, and his mother had somehow known about Garrett, so she had reached out. Perhaps Margaret was trying to understand the situation. Perhaps she was trying to protect the family in her own way. Knox hadn't yet considered the possibility that Margaret was the one who had connected Neil to Garrett, that she was the link, that everything had started with her. He hadn't considered it, because even though Knox Mercer could doubt anyone in the world, she was still his mother. Celeste knew. She knew Margaret wasn't trying to understand the situation. She had heard Margaret's voice clearly that night, the voice of someone giving orders, not asking questions. But Celeste hadn't spoken yet. She needed more proof, needed to be certain, because if she was wrong, she would lose Knox, and if she was right, Knox would lose his mother. Both outcomes were losses, so Celeste stayed silent and waited. She was used to waiting. Her whole life had been waiting. Knox returned to Chicago the very next morning. He held Celeste at the door, keeping her in his arms longer than usual, then went back to work. Neil Braddock had vanished. The gap inside the organization had been sealed. Knox believed the danger from Garrett Shaw had been cut off at the root, but he didn't know that the real root was still alive inside his own mansion, still sleeping 2 floors away from his room, still drinking tea every morning in the first-floor dining room. Margaret didn't stop because Neil had been exposed. In her eyes, Neil was only a tool, and when a tool broke, it could be replaced. 2 weeks after Neil left Chicago, Margaret called Garrett Shaw again. The call was short, only 4 minutes. She gave Garrett one single piece of information. Every Saturday afternoon, Celeste drove to the old neighborhood on the west side of Chicago to visit Jonah Pike, her best friend, the cook who had moved from Detroit to Chicago after the wedding. Celeste went alone, without bodyguards, because that was one of the conditions she had set with Knox. I need a space of my own. I need at least 1 day a week when I don't have to be Knox Mercer's wife, when I'm just Celeste. Knox agreed, because he loved her enough to respect that, and Margaret knew it, because Margaret knew everything in this house. That Saturday afternoon, Celeste drove the small car out of the mansion at 2 o'clock. She passed through downtown, turned toward the west side, and stopped in front of Jonah's small apartment in Humboldt Park. She parked by the street, turned off the engine, opened the door, and stepped out. The sidewalk was quiet, with only a few people walking in the distance. Celeste had just closed the car door when a black van pulled up close behind her. The van door opened, and 3 men stepped out. Celeste turned back, saw them coming toward her, and the survival instinct of a girl who had grown up in the shelter system ignited at once. She ran toward Jonah's door, but she only made it 4 steps before one of the 3 men blocked her path. Celeste fought back. She twisted her arm free, struggled, screamed, and used every bit of strength she had. But the 3 men were twice her size, and in less than 1 minute, they forced her into the van. The door slammed shut. The vehicle pulled away. The sidewalk returned to silence, leaving only Celeste's small car parked by the road, its door still open. Jonah heard the scream. He ran to the door, saw the black van turn the corner and disappear, saw Celeste's car with the door open, and understood at once. He called Knox. Knox answered after the first ring. Jonah spoke, his voice shaking. Celeste was forced into a vehicle. Black van, 3 men, just left Humboldt Park. Knox said nothing for 2 seconds. Then he said, "Stay there. Don't call the police." He hung up. 20 minutes later, Knox's phone rang. "Unknown number," he answered. Garrett Shaw's voice came through, slow and confident. "Knox, your wife is with me. She's safe, for now. You have 12 hours to sign over the entire Southport district. All of it. No negotiation. Otherwise, you'll never see her again." Knox listened, didn't answer, and ended the call. He didn't panic. He didn't punch the wall, didn't overturn the table, didn't shout at anyone. He sat down in the chair in his study, his eyes fixed straight ahead, and began to think. He called Victor Hale, the new right hand who had replaced Neil, the man Knox had chosen for one reason only. Victor had no ambition, only loyalty. "Victor, mobilize everyone. I need to find a black van that left Humboldt Park at 2:15 this afternoon. Check every traffic camera, every toll station, every parking lot within a 30-mile radius. I need an address in 6 hours." Victor didn't ask why. He only said, "Understood," and started working. 5 hours and 40 minutes later, Victor called back. An abandoned warehouse in the Southside Industrial District, near the port, right in Garrett Shaw's territory. A traffic camera had recorded the black van entering that area at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and never leaving. Knox stood, put on his coat, and for the first time in many years, he drove himself. No bodyguard sat in the front seat. Knox sat behind the wheel, and behind him were 4 cars carrying Victor's team. They reached the warehouse at 9 o'clock at night. Knox walked in first. The warehouse's iron door had already been opened by Victor's team. Inside, weak yellow light fell over a wide, empty space, cracked concrete, and the smell of old machine oil. Garrett Shaw stood in the middle, both hands in his pockets, with 4 of his men around him. And in the corner of the room, on the cold concrete floor, Celeste sat there. Her clothes were disheveled, her hair was messy, and there was a bruise on her right cheekbone, on the side of her face without scars. But Celeste didn't lower her head. She sat with her back straight, her eyes open, staring straight ahead. When she saw Knox walk in, her eyes didn't change. There were no tears, no collapse, only a look that said, "I'm still here. I'm still standing." Knox walked past Garrett without looking at him. He went straight to Celeste, knelt down, took off his coat, and draped it over her shoulders. His hand touched the bruise on her cheekbone, gently, only with his fingertips, as if he were afraid of hurting her more. Celeste placed her hand over Knox's, squeezed softly, and nodded. She was all right. She would be all right. Knox stood, turned back to Garrett, and looked at him. He didn't say much. He only said one sentence, his voice low, even, without the slightest tremor. "You touched the only thing in this world I can't lose." Garrett didn't answer. He looked at Knox, looked at the team standing behind Knox, and understood that there was no negotiation here. No 12 hours, no Southport District, nothing at all. There was only Knox Mercer standing in front of him, and those eyes weren't the eyes of a man who had come to talk. Garrett Shaw left Chicago that night. He didn't come back. He never came back. Knox brought Celeste out to the car, opened the door for her, and closed it gently. On the way back to the mansion, neither of them said anything. Celeste rested her head against the window, her eyes closed, her hand still holding Knox's hand on the middle seat. Knox drove with one hand, while the other held Celeste's hand, and he didn't let go the entire way. When the car stopped in front of the mansion, Knox turned off the engine but didn't get out. He sat still, looking at Celeste. Then he spoke, his voice smaller than Celeste had ever heard it before. "I'm sorry." Celeste opened her eyes and turned to look at him. "You have nothing to be sorry for." Knox shook his head. "I let you go alone. That will never happen again." Celeste didn't argue. She knew Knox meant what he said, and she knew that from tonight on, her life would be different. Not because she was more afraid, but because she had seen Knox kneel before her on the cold concrete floor, and she understood that the man all of Chicago feared, the man who never bowed his head to anyone, had knelt for her. That night, after they returned to the mansion, Knox told Celeste to rest first. He said he needed to handle a few calls. Celeste nodded and went upstairs, but she didn't sleep. She lay on the bed, eyes open, listening to Knox's voice drifting up from the study downstairs as he spoke on the phone. His voice was even, calm, giving Victor orders to deal with the aftermath, rearrange security, and check every lead that remained. Knox worked until nearly 2 o'clock in the morning before finally coming upstairs. He opened the door quietly, thinking Celeste was already asleep, and stepped into the darkness. He took off his jacket, draped it over a chair, then began unbuttoning his shirt, and that was when Celeste saw it. She couldn't see clearly in the dark, but she saw Knox stop at the third button. His right hand lifted, then lowered, then lifted again. He was trying to unbutton his shirt with one hand, because his left arm could barely rise. Knox turned, and when he passed through the strip of light spilling in from the window, Celeste saw a dark patch on the left shoulder of his shirt. It wasn't large, but it was enough for Celeste to know it wasn't shadow. It was blood. Dried blood, soaked through the fabric, forming a stiff stain on his shoulder. Celeste said nothing. She pretended to sleep, listening as Knox went into the bathroom, listening to the sound of running water, listening as he drew in one sharp breath when the water touched the wound. He was cleaning his wound alone, in the bathroom, at 2 o'clock in the morning, not wanting anyone to know. Celeste lay still, eyes fixed on the ceiling, and she thought about all the times she had cleaned her own wounds alone. The bruise on her knee after she was shoved down, the burn scars after the gas explosion, the nights she had sat in the bathroom at the shelter, bandaging herself, caring for herself, because there was no one else. And now, the strongest man she had ever known was doing exactly the same thing, hiding pain, bearing it alone, because he didn't want anyone to worry. The next morning, Knox got up early, put on a clean shirt, buttoned his suit jacket, and went down to the kitchen for coffee as he did every day. He moved normally, or tried to look normal. But Celeste saw it. When Knox reached for the coffee cup on the shelf, he leaned to the right instead of lifting his left arm. When he sat down in the chair, he sat one beat slower, his left shoulder slightly stiff. When he held his phone, he held it in his right hand, while his left hand rested on his thigh, unmoving. Knox Mercer could fool all of Chicago, but he couldn't fool the woman who had learned to read pain on other people's bodies since she was small. Celeste didn't ask. She didn't say, "Are you hurt?" or "Let me see," or anything else Knox would immediately deny before walking away. Instead, she waited until Knox left the kitchen. Then she stepped inside. The great kitchen of the Mercer mansion. The place where Margaret had once ordered her to pour tea for guests. The place where Celeste had always felt like an outsider. But that morning, she didn't care. She opened the refrigerator, took out rice, broth, scallions, and a little ginger. She began to cook porridge. Not porridge from a restaurant recipe, but porridge the way she had once made it in Detroit, in the tiny kitchen of her bakery, for herself after long days, for Jonah when he was sick, for the elderly neighbor, Mrs. Whitfield, during winter. Simple porridge, only rice, broth, ginger, and thyme. Celeste stood beside the stove, stirring slowly, and for the first time in the Mercer mansion, she felt that this kitchen was hers. She ladled the porridge into a bowl, placed it on a tray, and carried it up to Knox's study on the second floor. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Knox sat behind the desk, reading documents, his left hand still resting on his thigh. He looked up, saw Celeste holding the tray, saw the steaming bowl of porridge, and stopped. Celeste set the tray on the desk, right in front of Knox, without saying anything. Knox looked at the bowl of porridge, then looked at Celeste. "You don't need to do this," he said, his voice soft. Celeste pulled out a chair and sat across from Knox, looked straight into his eyes, and said, "You didn't need to take that wound either, but you still did." Knox didn't answer. He looked at Celeste, then at the bowl of porridge, then back at her, and he picked up the spoon and began to eat. He ate slowly, spoon by spoon, and Celeste sat there in silence, watching him eat. No one said anything for 10 minutes. There was no need to. The room was quiet, with only the sound of the spoon touching the bowl, the sound of Knox swallowing, the ticking of the clock on the wall. And in those 10 minutes, for the first time since they had met, something in the relationship between Knox and Celeste changed. It wasn't a large change. There was no declaration, no tears. It was only that before this, Knox had always been the protector, and Celeste had always been the one protected. Knox was the strong one. Celeste was the one who needed to be kept safe. But that morning, in the second-floor study, with a bowl of rice and ginger porridge, Celeste was the one caring for Knox. She was the one who saw the pain he hid, the one who went down to the kitchen to cook for him, the one who sat there not because she was weak, but because she was strong enough to care for someone else. And Knox, for the first time, allowed someone to care for him. Not because he was weak, but because with Celeste, he didn't have to be strong every moment. That afternoon, after Knox finished the bowl of porridge and Celeste carried the tray back down to the kitchen, she returned to the study. She stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame, looking at Knox. He was reading through the documents again, but he sensed her standing there. He looked up. "Is something wrong?" Celeste stepped inside and sat down in the chair across from Knox, the same chair where she had sat while watching him eat the porridge. But this time, her face was different. It wasn't the face of someone caring for him. It was the face of someone preparing to say something she knew would change everything. "I need to tell you everything. From the beginning, and you need to hear all of it before you say anything." Knox set the documents down. He looked at Celeste and nodded. Celeste told him. She told him about the early days in the mansion, when Margaret ordered her to pour tea for guests, presenting her like a servant in front of everyone. She told him about the daily barbs, gentle on the surface but precise as a blade. She told him about the night Knox went to Las Vegas, when Tina Wells sat in her chair, when Margaret said, "Beautiful women light up an entire room," right in front of her. She told him about being shoved in the hallway, about the night she sat alone on the bed, wiping the bruise on her knee. And finally, she told him about the phone call. Not the phone call she had mentioned to Knox before, when she only said Margaret had contacted Garrett. This time, she told him everything. She told him that Margaret's voice on that call hadn't been the voice of someone asking questions, but the voice of someone giving orders. She told him Margaret had given Garrett Celeste's schedule, that every Saturday afternoon she went to visit Jonah alone, that she had no bodyguards with her. She told him she had hidden this because she wanted more proof, because she knew that if she spoke without enough proof, Knox might think she had misunderstood, or worse, Knox would have to choose between her and his mother without knowing where the truth really stood. But now, after what had happened at the warehouse, after Celeste had sat on the cold concrete floor with a bruise on her face because her own mother-in-law had shown the enemy the way to her, She couldn't hold it in anymore. Knox listened. He listened from beginning to end, without interrupting, without asking questions, without reacting. His face didn't change. But Celeste noticed one small detail. Knox's right hand rested on the desk, and his fingers slowly curled inward, tightening, until his knuckles turned white. That was his only reaction. When Celeste finished, silence fell over the room, heavy, thick, like a wall. Knox said nothing for 1 minute, 2 minutes. Celeste sat still and waited, without rushing him. She knew he was processing it, not the information, because the information was simple. He was processing the fact that the person who had done those things was his mother. Then Knox spoke, his voice low and slow, each word heavy as stone. "From now on, no one touches you as long as I'm still breathing." He stood, walked to Celeste, placed a hand on her shoulder, and squeezed gently. Then he walked out of the room. Knox went straight to Margaret's room on the first floor. He didn't knock. He opened the door and stepped inside. Margaret was sitting in an armchair, reading a book, a cup of tea on the table beside her. She looked up, saw Knox, and she knew, not because of the expression on Knox's face, because his face had no expression at all. She knew because of the way he entered. No permission, no knock, no sitting down. He stood in the middle of the room, looking down at her, and placed a phone on the tea table. On the screen was a record of the calls between Margaret's number and Garrett Shaw's number. Dates, times, duration, frequency. 12 calls in 6 weeks. Margaret looked at the phone screen, then looked at Knox. She didn't deny it. She didn't ask, "How did you know?" She set the book down, straightened her back, lifted her head, and said, "I did all of it for this family. She doesn't deserve to stand in this house. And if you refuse to see that, then someone had to." Knox didn't lose his temper. He didn't raise his voice, didn't slam the table, didn't point a finger in his mother's face. He spoke, his voice still even, still calm, but every word cut deeper than any shout. "You revealed my wife's schedule to Garrett Shaw. Garrett's men forced her into a vehicle. She was held in a warehouse for 6 hours. Her face was bruised. You almost got my wife killed. That isn't protecting the family. That's betrayal." Margaret opened her mouth to say more, but Knox lifted his hand. Not to strike, not even to silence her harshly. He only raised it slightly, and Margaret stopped, because in her entire life, she had never seen Knox look at her with those eyes. Not anger, not hatred, disappointment, deep, cold, and absolute. "You're still my mother," Knox said. "That doesn't change. But from today on, you no longer have the right to decide anything in this house. No more access to Mercer Holdings accounts. No more contact with any partners. No more right to live in this mansion." Margaret stood, her face gone pale. "You're throwing me out?" Knox looked at his mother. "I'm not throwing you out. I'm protecting my family. The thing you said you were doing, but never did." The next morning, Knox called the entire mansion staff into the great room. He stood at the head of the room, with Celeste beside him. He read 7 names, one by one. "These 7 people will leave the mansion today. Their wages will be paid through the end of the month. There won't be a second chance." Those 7 were the people who had helped Margaret all along, the servant who had said, "Ma'am, your seat has already been taken." The person who had arranged for Tina Wells to come to the mansion, the ones who had ignored Celeste when she needed help. All of them left that morning. A new staff was selected by Victor Hale, people loyal to Knox, and only to Knox. That afternoon, a car arrived to take Margaret away. She brought 2 suitcases and 1 box of personal belongings. She didn't look back at the mansion when the car rolled away. She was taken to a small house in the northern suburbs of Chicago, clean and fully furnished, but smaller than her old bedroom in the mansion. Margaret stepped into the house, set her suitcases on the floor, and looked around. 4 walls, 1 sitting room, 1 bedroom, 1 small kitchen. No servants, no guests. No one calling her Mrs. Mercer. She sat down in the only chair in the sitting room, and for the first time in 20 years since her husband had died, Margaret Mercer was completely alone. 3 months after the day Margaret left the mansion, the house changed. Not in any grand way, not with repainted walls or new furniture. It was something in the air, lighter. Celeste came down to the kitchen every morning without having to hear a single mocking remark. She sat in her own chair at the dining table without anyone looking at her with measuring eyes. She baked in the great kitchen in the afternoons, and the smell of butter, vanilla, and brown sugar spread through the entire first floor, replacing the scent of expensive perfume and the tension that had once settled into every corner of the walls. For the first time, the Mercer mansion smelled like a real home. Then Celeste discovered she was pregnant. She knew before she went to the doctor, because her body told her. That morning, she sat on the edge of the bathtub, holding the test in her hand, looking at the 2 lines appearing on it, and she didn't know what she felt. There was joy, yes, but woven through that joy was a fear she couldn't name. She had grown up without a mother. She didn't know what her mother looked like, what her voice sounded like, how she would have held her. She had no memory of being loved by a mother, so how was she supposed to know how to become one? She sat there for a very long time, until Knox knocked on the bathroom door and asked if she was all right. Celeste opened the door and handed the test to Knox. He looked down, looked at the 2 lines, then looked up at Celeste. And for the first time since Celeste had known Knox, since the day he walked into the bakery in Detroit, since the dinner where he made his declaration in front of 23 people, since the night he knelt on the warehouse floor and draped his coat over her shoulders, Knox Mercer smiled. Not a slight lift of the mouth, not a half smile, not the closest thing to a smile. A real smile, with his whole face, with his eyes. He pulled Celeste into his arms, held her tight, his face buried in her hair, and Celeste felt his chest tremble softly. He was laughing and crying at the same time, and he didn't hide it. For the first time, Knox Mercer didn't hide. The weeks after that were the most peaceful weeks of Celeste's life. Every evening, after Knox finished handling his work, he went up to the 2nd floor, found Celeste, and the 2 of them sat on the bedroom balcony overlooking Lake Michigan. The lake stretched wide, its surface changing color with the evening light, from silver to pink to violet to black. Celeste leaned back in her chair. Knox sat beside her, and they stayed there until the sun had completely set. They didn't talk much. Some nights, Knox told her about his father, the only man Knox had ever respected, the man who taught him that real strength wasn't making others afraid, but making others believe. Some nights, Celeste told him about the bakery in Detroit, about the smell of flour at 4 o'clock in the morning when she began kneading dough, about the way the yellow light in the shop shone through the glass door at night and made the whole corner of the street look warmer. Some nights, they said nothing at all. They simply sat there, and the silence wasn't heavy, wasn't uncomfortable, but gentle, as if for the first time, both of them had been allowed to rest. One evening, while Celeste was sitting on the balcony, Knox placed his hand on her belly. Her belly had begun to show, slight, round, warm, and the exact moment Knox's hand touched her, the baby kicked. Softly, like a tiny knock from the inside. Knox startled and looked at Celeste, his eyes wide. Celeste laughed. "The baby is saying hello to Daddy." Knox said nothing, but he didn't move his hand away. He kept it there and waited. And when the baby kicked again, Knox closed his eyes, and Celeste saw the corner of his mouth lift. Slowly, gently, truly. "I want our child to grow up not being afraid of anyone," Celeste said softly, her eyes on the lake. "Not afraid of outsiders, not afraid of anyone inside the house. I want our child to grow up normal." Knox took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, tightening gently. "Our child won't be afraid, because the baby has the bravest mother I've ever met." Celeste rested her head against Knox's shoulder. The wind from Lake Michigan moved softly across the balcony, carrying the cool breath of the water. And in that moment, everything was perfect. But 30 miles north of the Mercer mansion, in the small house in the suburbs, Margaret Mercer sat beside the window, holding her phone. She wasn't calling anyone. She was only reading a message from one of her old acquaintances in the upper class, someone who still kept in touch with her more out of curiosity than loyalty. The message was short. "Celeste is pregnant. Knox is very happy." Margaret set the phone down and looked out at the darkness beyond the window. Her face showed nothing, but in her eyes, something was moving. Not anger, not sadness, determination. The kind of determination that belongs to a person who has lost everything and believes she has only one final move left. Knox had to go to Milwaukee for 2 days to meet with a new partner replacing the contracts lost after the Warren Caldwell and Neil Braddock incidents. He didn't want to go, especially with Celeste 7 months pregnant, but Victor Hale said the deal couldn't be delayed. Knox called Celeste before getting into the car. 2 days. I'll be back before Friday night." Celeste said, "I know. go. I'm fine." Knox hesitated for 1 second, then added, "Lock the bedroom door when you sleep." Celeste laughed softly. "You worry too much." Knox didn't laugh back. "I worry just enough." He got into the car, and the black vehicle rolled out of Chicago at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Margaret knew Knox had left. She didn't need anyone to tell her. She only needed to look out the window of the suburban house and count. She had lived in the Mercer mansion for 30 years. She knew Knox's schedule the way she knew her own breathing. When Knox traveled away on business, he always left on a Wednesday or Thursday afternoon, and he always returned before Friday night, 2 days. That was Margaret's window of time, 11 o'clock on Thursday night. The Mercer mansion was silent. Victor Hale's new team guarded the main gate and the side gate, and cameras watched every corner, but Margaret didn't go through the gate. She knew a passage no one on the new team knew, because it wasn't on the architectural plans. A small door behind the garden, hidden behind a wall of vines, led into the basement. That door had been built when her husband was still alive, for times when someone needed to enter or leave without anyone knowing. Margaret still had the key. She had never returned it, because no one knew to ask for it. Margaret entered the mansion at 11:20. She moved through the darkness, from the basement to the first floor, from the first floor to the second floor, her steps light, exact. She knew which tiles made noise, which stair creaked. She stopped in front of Knox and Celeste's bedroom. The door wasn't locked. Celeste had forgotten, or she hadn't thought it was necessary, because her mother-in-law had been sent away, and Knox had replaced the entire staff. Who would come in? Margaret opened the door gently and stepped inside. Celeste was asleep, lying on her right side, one hand resting on her pregnant belly, breathing evenly. On the bedside table sat a glass water pitcher and a cup. Celeste always drank water before sleeping, and when she woke in the middle of the night, a habit Margaret knew because she had lived with Celeste long enough to know all her habits. Margaret stood beside the bed and looked down at Celeste. She looked at the burned, scarred half of her face against the pillow, looked at the round belly rising beneath the thin blanket. Her hand trembled, not because she was afraid. It trembled because she knew she was standing before a line that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. But Margaret Mercer had already crossed too many lines. She took a small bottle from her coat pocket, opened the cap, tilted it over the water pitcher, and let what was inside dissolve into the water. She placed the pitcher back in exactly the same spot, at exactly the same angle, as if no one had touched it. Then she walked out of the room, closed the door, went down to the basement, slipped out through the small door behind the garden, and disappeared into the night. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Celeste woke because she was thirsty. She reached for the pitcher, poured a glass of water, and drank it all. The water was cool, with no smell, no strange taste. She set the glass down, lay back, closed her eyes, and never opened them again. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the new servant knocked on the door with breakfast. No one answered. A second knock. Silence. The servant opened the door, stepped inside, and saw Celeste lying motionless on the bed, her skin pale blue, her lips colorless, her hand still resting on her belly. The servant ran to her, called Celeste's name, shook her shoulder. Celeste didn't respond. The servant screamed for emergency help. Knox was in a meeting in Milwaukee when his phone vibrated. Victor Hale was calling. Knox answered, and for the first time in his life, Victor heard Knox's voice change. It didn't change into shouting or cursing. It disappeared. His voice lost everything, leaving only one sentence. Which hospital? Then he ended the call, stood up in the middle of the meeting, walked out without saying a word to anyone in the room, got into the car, and drove through the night back to Chicago. The 3.5-hour road from Milwaukee to Chicago passed in silence, Knox's hands gripping the steering wheel, his eyes fixed straight on the darkness of the highway, and in his mind there was only one image repeating again and again. Celeste sitting on the balcony, her hand on her belly, smiling, saying, "The baby is saying hello to Daddy." Knox arrived at the hospital at 2 o'clock in the morning. He ran inside, the first time Knox Mercer had ever run in front of other people. A doctor stopped him in the hallway outside the emergency room. "Mr. Mercer, your wife is in critical condition. We found an unknown substance in her blood. The baby has to be delivered by emergency surgery right now. The baby is arriving earlier than expected, but he is stable." Knox asked, his voice hoarse. "What about my wife?" The doctor fell silent for 1 second, the longest second of Knox's life. "We're doing everything we can." Knox stood outside the operating room. The hospital hallway was empty, the white lights cold and bright, the sting of antiseptic thick in the air. Knox Mercer, the man who controlled the largest underworld empire in Chicago, the man who had never bowed his head to anyone, the man who could destroy anyone's career with a single sentence, stood there alone and could do nothing. There was no file he could slide across a table, no phone call he could make, no order that could save Celeste. And he knelt. Right there in the hospital hallway, on the cold tile floor, Knox dropped to his knees, clasped both hands in front of his chest, lowered his head, and prayed. He didn't know how to pray properly, because he had never prayed before. But he spoke, whispering, his voice shaking, words that no one heard except him and whoever might be listening above. Please don't take her away. Take anything of mine. But don't take her. Jonah Pike arrived at the hospital at 3 o'clock in the morning. He had received the news from Victor Hale, whom Knox had ordered to call Jonah, because Knox knew Celeste would want Jonah there. Jonah ran in, saw Knox kneeling on the hallway floor, and stopped. He had never seen Knox like that. He sat down beside Knox, said nothing, and only placed a hand on his shoulder. The two men sat there, in front of the operating room door, and waited. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the doctor stepped out. The baby is healthy. A boy. Knox stood. My wife? The doctor drew a breath. She didn't make it. We're very sorry. Knox stood motionless. He didn't fall, didn't scream, didn't cry. He only stood there, like a man who had just had everything pulled out of his body. Jonah stood beside him, tears running down his face, but inside his mind, something didn't fit. He knew Celeste. He had known her since she was 15 years old in the shelter in Detroit. He knew she had survived the gas explosion when doctors said she would die. He knew she was stronger than anyone he had ever met. Jonah asked for permission to go into the room and see Celeste one last time. He stood beside the bed, looking at her lying there, skin pale, eyes closed, the machines already turned off. And Jonah saw something the doctor hadn't seen, or had missed. Celeste's chest was rising and falling, very faintly, almost invisible. But Jonah saw it, because he knew Celeste's breathing. He had sat beside her bed for 3 months after the gas explosion, counting every breath. And he knew when Celeste was breathing and when she wasn't. She was breathing. Knox didn't cry in the hospital. He didn't cry when the doctor said, she didn't make it. He didn't cry when the nurse placed his son in his arms for the first time. The baby so tiny, eyes closed, fists clenched tight, healthy but without his mother beside him. Knox held his child, looked down at that tiny face, and only stood there, silent, like a man trying to keep himself from breaking apart. Then he handed the baby back to the nurse, stepped into the hallway, and began doing the thing he knew how to do best. Find the truth. Knox called Victor Hale at 5 o'clock in the morning. Check every camera inside and outside the mansion last night. Every angle, every time frame, from 8 o'clock at night to this very moment. Check the areas without cameras too, and find me every entrance into the mansion that doesn't go through the gate. Victor worked through that entire morning. The cameras didn't record anyone entering the mansion through the main gate or the side gate. No strange cars, no strangers. But when the security team checked the garden behind the house, they found the small door behind the wall of vines. The door wasn't on the architectural plans the new team had received when Knox replaced the staff. The lock was old, but there were fresh scratches on the metal surface, signs that a key had been used recently. Victor called Knox back. There's a secret entrance from the back garden leading down into the basement. It isn't in the records. The lock shows signs of recent use. Knox listened, then stayed silent for 5 seconds. He didn't need to ask who knew about that entrance. There was only one person who had lived in the mansion long enough to know. The person who had built that door with her husband 30 years ago. Knox didn't call the police. He didn't hand Margaret over to anyone. In Knox's world, the law was something meant for other people. He handled things his own way. He called the Mercer Holdings lawyer and ordered Margaret Mercer's name erased from every document, every will, and every inheritance right, stripping her not just of company access like before, but of her entire personal wealth. Margaret had once owned 20% of Mercer Holdings shares, numerous private bank accounts, real estate in 3 states, and a network of connections she had spent 20 years building. Within 48 hours, all of it vanished. The shares were transferred, the accounts frozen, the properties sold. Knox left Margaret exactly one thing: the small house in the suburbs, and a monthly allowance enough for her to live on. Nothing more. He didn't go see Margaret. He didn't call. He didn't say a single word. Knox's silence was the heaviest sentence Margaret had ever received, because it meant that to Knox, she no longer existed. The news spread through Chicago's upper class, not through the press, but through whispers in sitting rooms, in clubs, in cars. Margaret Mercer had been cast out by her son. Celeste had been harmed. The baby lived. The mother didn't survive. And Margaret was behind it. No one confirmed it, but everyone believed it. Because in this world, when Knox Mercer cut ties with his own mother, the reason couldn't be small. Margaret sat in the suburban house, alone, day after day. She didn't go out, didn't call anyone, and no one called her. At first came anger. She was angry at Knox, angry at Celeste, angry at the whole world for turning its back on her. Then anger turned into bitterness. Then bitterness turned into emptiness. She ate little, slept little, sat for hours. Stress gathered inside her body, like water rising in a reservoir with no spillway. 2 months after the day she left the mansion, Margaret was sitting in the chair in the living room, holding a cup of tea. When the cup fell to the floor, her right hand went numb. The right side of her face stiffened. She tried to stand, but her right leg wouldn't obey. She fell to the floor and lay there, alone, in the small house where no one knew she was, until the grocery delivery person arrived the next morning and saw her through the glass door. A stroke. The doctor said it was caused by prolonged high blood pressure, severe psychological stress, and physical exhaustion. Margaret survived, but the right side of her face was permanently paralyzed, twisted downward, the corner of her mouth pulled low, her right eye unable to close fully. The woman who had once sat across from Celeste and said, "Do you think my son will look at this face every morning when he wakes up and not regret it?" now carried on her own face the very thing she had once used to attack someone else. A disfigured face. Not from fire, but permanent. And every morning when she looked in the mirror, Margaret saw exactly what she had once wanted Celeste to see. Imperfection. Impossible to hide. Impossible to repair. When Margaret left the hospital, she tried to contact Dorothy Conroy. Dorothy, her friend of 20 years, the woman who had sat beside her at every party, the woman who had once said, "Margaret, you're the strongest woman I know." Margaret called. Dorothy didn't answer. Margaret called again. The line was busy. Margaret called a third time, a fourth time, a fifth time. No one picked up. She sent a message. No one replied. Finally, Margaret drove to Dorothy's house, the mansion in Lake Forest. She rang the bell. The gatekeeper opened it slightly, looked at Margaret, looked at the twisted, paralyzed half of her face, and said, "Mrs. Conroy isn't home." Margaret looked up at the second floor. Dorothy's bedroom light was on. The curtain was slightly open, and Margaret saw someone standing behind it, looking down, then stepping back. Dorothy was home. Dorothy saw Margaret standing below the gate, and Dorothy chose not to open the door. Margaret stood outside Dorothy's gate for 15 minutes. The cold wind blew through the air, the right side of her face numb, though she couldn't feel it because that half of her face had already lost sensation. She stood there, looking up at the closed door, and for the first time in her life, Margaret Mercer understood what it felt like to stand outside a door she wasn't allowed to enter. The feeling of being abandoned. The feeling of no one wanting to look at her face. The feeling Celeste had lived with every day since the gas explosion. Every day when she stepped out onto the street and people turned away. Every day when Margaret ordered her to pour tea and introduced her as a servant. Margaret turned around, drove back to the small house, stepped inside, closed the door, and sat down in the only chair in the living room. She didn't cry. She had forgotten how to cry long ago. Around the same time, on the other side of the city, Paige Conroy was driving on the highway after dinner. She had drunk 2 glasses of wine. Not enough to be drunk, but enough to slow her reflexes by half a second. Half a second was everything. A car ahead braked suddenly, and Paige braked too, but half a beat too late. Her car slammed into the rear of the car in front. The airbag burst open. The windshield shattered, and a piece of glass sliced across her face. Paige survived, but when the doctor removed the bandages at the hospital and handed her a mirror, Paige saw a scar stretching from her forehead across her right cheek and down to her chin. The doctor said plastic surgery could improve it, but the scar would remain forever. Paige looked into the mirror, and she remembered what she had said at the Lakeshore Club, the words she had thrown toward Celeste without thinking. A face like that should stay that way forever. It deserves to. Now the face in the mirror was hers, and the scar on her face would stay there forever. A curse doesn't fly away. It comes back. But Celeste didn't die. And this story didn't end in the hospital hallway that night. Jonah Pike wasn't a doctor. He was a cook, an ordinary man whose hands were more familiar with knives and pans than with stethoscopes. But Jonah knew one thing. No one in that hospital knew. Celeste Dawson didn't die easily. When he stood beside her bed in the emergency room and saw her chest rising and falling, so faintly it was almost invisible, he didn't call the doctor. He knew that if he called the doctor, they would say he was mistaken. They would tell him it was a muscle reflex. They would shake their heads and walk away. Jonah did the only thing he could do. He called Dr. Howard Langley, a specialist in Detroit whom Celeste had fed free pastries every week for 2 years, when he had just opened a small clinic in the old neighborhood and didn't have enough patients to pay the rent. Celeste brought pastries every Monday morning, set them on the reception desk, and said, "You don't need to pay me. Just eat enough, then go heal people." Dr. Langley hadn't forgotten. He had never forgotten. When Jonah called at 4 o'clock in the morning and said Celeste's name, Dr. Langley asked only one question. Where is she? Using the chaotic moment when Knox left the ward to investigate the security footage and bribing a morgue transport driver he knew from his past, Jonah managed to slip her out before anyone noticed. Jonah moved Celeste to Dr. Langley's private clinic in the suburbs of Detroit that very night. Secretly, without telling Knox, without telling anyone, because after everything that had happened, Jonah didn't know who in Knox Mercer's world could still be trusted. Dr. Langley identified the substance in Celeste's blood, treated it, and cared for her for 3 months. Celeste recovered. Slowly, day by day, but she recovered, because Celeste Dawson had never known how to give up. The day Jonah called Knox and said, "Celeste is alive." Knox was sitting in his study, one hand holding his sleeping son against his chest, the other resting on the desk. He heard those words, and he didn't react for 10 seconds. 10 seconds long enough for Victor Hale, standing outside the door, to think the call had been disconnected. Then Knox spoke, his voice breaking. The first time Knox Mercer's voice had ever broken in front of another person. "Bring her home." Jonah brought Celeste back to Chicago on a late spring afternoon. The car stopped in front of the Mercer mansion gate, and Knox stood at the door. He wore a white shirt, no suit jacket, holding his son in his arms, the 3-month-old baby sleeping on his father's shoulder. Celeste opened the car door and stepped down. She was thinner, paler, her hair shorter than before, her steps slow, one hand braced against the car door. But she stood straight. Her back still didn't bend. Knox watched Celeste walk toward him, and he said nothing. He didn't say, "Are you all right?" or "I missed you," or any of the thousands of sentences he had thought of over the past 3 months. He only stepped forward, holding their child with one arm and pulling Celeste into his chest with the other, and kept her there. The 3 of them stood in front of the Mercer mansion gate, silent, under the afternoon sunlight. Celeste looked down at the baby in Knox's arms. She looked at her son for the first time. His eyes were closed, his lashes long, his nose small, his lips pink, his 10 tiny fingers gripping his father's shirt. Celeste reached out and touched her son's face, gently, her fingertips passing over his forehead, his cheek, his chin. She counted every finger, every toe, slowly, as if she were afraid that if she counted too quickly, the moment would disappear. Tears ran down her face, across the burned, scarred half, across the unscarred half, making no difference between them. "He's so beautiful," Celeste whispered, her voice trembling. Knox looked at her, then at the baby, then back at her. "He looks like his mother," he said. Celeste smiled, the first smile since she had woken in Dr. Langley's clinic. "Which half?" Knox looked into Celeste's eyes, not at the scar, not away, exactly like the first time in the bakery in Detroit. The most beautiful half. 2 weeks later, Margaret asked to see Celeste. Knox didn't want to allow it, but Celeste said, "Let me see her. I need to." Knox looked at her for a long time, then nodded. Margaret came to the mansion in the afternoon. She was gaunt, her hair almost entirely gray, her back more bent than before. The right side of her face was paralyzed, twisted downward, the corner of her mouth pulled low. She stepped into the sitting room, where Celeste was waiting, and the first thing Margaret did was lift her right hand to cover the paralyzed half of her face. A reflex, as if she didn't want anyone to see. Margaret sat down across from Celeste, The two women looked at each other, and between them stood everything that had happened. The mocking remarks, the served tea, Tina Wells sitting in Celeste's chair, the secret door behind the garden, the water pitcher on the bedside table, and the 3 months Celeste had spent between life and death. Margaret spoke, her voice hoarse, the right side of her mouth unable to move, so every word came out distorted and difficult. I'm sorry, not because I want to be forgiven, but because now I understand. I understand what it feels like to look in the mirror and see that your face isn't what it used to be. I understand what it feels like to stand in front of someone else's door and not have it opened. I understand what it feels like to be alone. Celeste looked at Margaret's hand covering half her face. She remembered every time Margaret had stared directly at the burn scars on her face without blinking, using them as a weapon, using them to remind Celeste that she wasn't worthy. Celeste reached out, gently took Margaret's hand that was covering her face, and pulled it down, slowly, gently, revealing the paralyzed half, twisted, imperfect. You don't need to cover it, Celeste said. I've never covered mine. Margaret looked at Celeste, and for the first time in her life, tears fell from her eyes. Not tears of anger, not tears of self-pity, tears of a person who had finally seen what she had been blind to her entire life. Celeste held Margaret's hand, held it tightly, and said, I'm not forgiving you because you deserve it. I'm forgiving you because I don't want to carry any more weight. I've carried enough. That afternoon, Celeste stood in front of the second-floor bedroom window, holding her son in her arms, looking out over Lake Michigan. The lake was calm. The evening light reflected on the water, shifting from silver to pink to violet. Knox entered the room, stood behind her, and placed a hand on her shoulder. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The baby stirred in Celeste's arms, opened his eyes, looked up at his mother's face, and wrapped his little hand around her finger. Celeste smiled, a smile she didn't need to hide, on a face she didn't need to cover. The story of Celeste and Knox wasn't a fairy tale. No magic saved Celeste. There was only a girl who sold pastries and once fed a poor doctor for free, and years later, that small kindness came back to save her life when she least expected it. Cruelty never protects anything. It only destroys the one who plants it. Margaret wanted to protect the Mercer family, and she destroyed herself. Paige wanted to bring Celeste down with a curse, and that curse came back to find her. And Celeste, the woman who had nothing but her hands and her heart, ended up being the one who stood strongest. Because true beauty doesn't live on the skin. It lives in the way we treat people who can do nothing for us. If this story touched your heart, please press like and share it so more people can listen. How did this story make you feel? Please write it in the comments below, so we can hear the feelings from deep inside your heart. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss new stories every day. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.